as you know, in our project, we have 3 working groups, one on conflict prevention, one in conflict resolution, and one on governance and policies with 16 sub-projects. So many topics, many issues, many challenges, but I think many of the sub-projects will have the same challenge, is to find the balance between usability and accessibility on one side and informal and deliberate participation on the other. So I think your last slide was very, for all of us, we could, all the sub-projects can just focus on that and map a research agenda around this this challenge. So yes, I think the best way maybe we have 70 participants. We can expect questions from a wide range of questions, and I think the best way to do it is as Karim and Maria suggested, to ask our participants to raise hands, and then we'll take questions, you know, from one participant to another. And Carl first raised his hand, so please, Carl. Anis also raised his hand, so I'll take the sequence. So I'll manage the the questions, so you can focus on answering most of them, Ayelet. So. That's great. Let's start with Carl, and then I also noticed Anis, and I will, yeah, okay. Carl.
Yes, thank you so much for a very provocative and fascinating talk. Yeah, I wanted to mention the idea of built-in friction. As I understand it, this is an idea in traffic flow design as well, that in fact, in some cases, accidents can be reduced by putting in some traffic calming or traffic circle or something that actually takes people's attention so they're not on autopilot. An interesting analogy. But anyway, my question is, as you say, there is no design, kind of neutral design, everything has some cognitive effects that influence choices. But so my question then is there a good theory about what courts should be, or a tribunal should be optimizing? So is it, you could imagine, well, maybe it should be minimizing litigation, or perhaps it should be minimizing the default rate. Those things are actually not the same, or maximizing the joint litigant satisfaction. Somehow or other, once you've made explicit that your designs are affecting these outcomes, then it seems like it's incumbent on the institution to be explicit about what it is that they're trying to optimize, since they can't sort of pretend that they're not optimizing some things at the expense of other things. So I'm interested in your thoughts on that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think that's a really great question, and you're sort of pinpointing one of the most difficult things about court reform generally, and it's not just online courts. Which is, how do we tailor the design of our system, of our procedures, to the goals of the system? And I imagine that in different justice systems, the goal might be different, and that even in different procedures, the goal might be different, right? So if we're taking small claims and as an example, or debt collection, you know, the goals may not be the same. But what I do think is a common goal to all of them, which is why I chose it in this paper, and perhaps it's a cheap choice, is that whatever decision people are making, it should be an informed and deliberate one as they go about taking it. And this is interesting because I think even now in today's court system, and this is evident also in just when you look at the distribution of outcomes in courts, people don't go to court with a single goal in mind or with a single interest in mind. Some people really just want the defendant to own what they did and apologize. Others really need to hear a validation from the judge that they're right. Others just want the problem solved. They don't care about anything. They just want their money back, or the problem solved, or the warrant removed, or whatever. And so people have different interests, and the court serves these different goals of litigants. So if we sort of go back to, you know, the Hobbes' social contract, you know, and the role of courts as an institution in society which draws its legitimacy from providing people with an avenue to resolve their disputes without resorting, to violent action, then the primary goals that should motivate designers is to make sure that people get that from court. The sense that there's a legitimate solution that they trust, that they felt that it served the purpose for them. And that's why I've chosen sort of as a general overarching goal, informed and deliberate participation. I do think, thinking more broadly, that the promise of ODR lies not in transforming the experiences of those, 10% or 30% of people, of litigants that get the premium service. They actually get to a court hearing, even if it's just a pre-trial hearing or to really a full trial process, but it's in transforming the experiences of the large bulk of litigants that get nothing like that from courts. And so in that sense, I think it's a lot about redress and solving the problem in a convincing way for people in a way that they trust. And that should be the design goal.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Carl. Anis was second.
Thank you. So thank you for this really, really interesting presentation. It's really fascinating. So this seems like this kind of power of shaping the interface is super subtle, but extremely powerful in influencing the outcome of cases. So as you mentioned, it seems to have almost a normative effect where, for example, by shaping the interface, you could affect the chance of winning of a certain party and affect what the outcome could be. So I want to ask a bit, who should wield this power? It seems like the power is almost, in shaping the outcome, almost more important than the law itself that has been established through a democratic process. So I want to ask who should shape this interface, and how do we make sure that they shape it in a way that's aligned with our interests?
So I think, well, it's court designers that shape this interface. It's an interesting question, who now is the primary decision maker about how these interface decisions are being made, right? Is it IT? Is it just some UX UI expert that has some understanding of what the goals are and so forth? I definitely think, and I often teach this to my students, that lawyers should play a much bigger role in these process design and process architecture and ethical considerations, because it's not just the user interface. There are ramifications, really important ramifications to this. So it should be sort of a combined a team effort, so to speak, of people who understand information systems, understand UX UI, and of people who understand the legal meaning of each step of the way and the possible biases or considerations that may impact or shape the decisions that litigants take throughout the process. I think that when courts take a more user-centric design approach, then that assumes in and of itself a testable cycle where you keep testing how your process is not only received by users, which is I think what most courts now understand as taking a human-centric design, but also how it impacts their behavior. And when that is rolled into sort of standard design procedure, then design is a dynamic task. It evolves and it changes as you realize that there are certain impacts, and there's this as you balance between the different goals, right? As you see, the effect of your actual designs, then you're able to make these normative decisions. What is more important in this case type? Which litigants are more vulnerable, so we should optimize for them? Is it appropriate to use differential design, right? To dynamically tailor the interface so that we don't have this adverse effect or this distributive effect on different user populations. What I think happens more often is that the interface in design is designed in a way that its designers assume would work for the imagined litigant, and there may be several user stories of several key litigants, but these issues of how it behaviorally affects them, as opposed to how satisfied they are with the process, or whether in the end they say that it was fair, are not taking into consideration. Because I didn't get into it in my presentation, but you can imagine a state where there's sort of like a false consciousness. You're sure that it was great, but actually you didn't understand fully what different elements in the process meant and how it may affect you in the future. So to sum it up, I think it should be a joint team. It should be a work in progress in an iterative cycle, and we should tailor the design to the particular goals of a certain process, taking into consideration the possibility of dynamically tailoring the interface to different user populations. And if some of you are familiar with the idea of the multi-door courthouse, Frank Sanders' 1970s idea of how courts could be different things for different litigants, for different types of disputes, for different cases, we could expand this. Technology now offers us the ability to really have a dynamic court that changes in order to be accessible and supportive for different litigant populations. Now, I realize that this is a fairly radical assertion, but I think we should at least talk about what may be its appropriate limits, where it actually helps us maximize distributive justice and procedural justice in better ways.
Thank you.
Thank you, Annette. Gilbert also raised his hands, but just before we go to Gilbert, Ayelet, it might be interesting for you to know that we have today a mix of researchers and also partners, so stakeholders, and
I think I've seen Richard Rogers in an earlier when you were taking the picture.
Okay, yeah. So we have stakeholders from the entire, let's say, legal and online community, and I think some of the questions. So I invite them to also join us in this conversation and bring their input. Especially, I think the last question was I think absolutely relevant, and it might be interesting to have their input too. Like, who are the court designers? What are the assumptions behind the behind the choices that the architecture of the platform. So please, so this is an invitation to all of our partners, if you're interested, to jump in and bring your input on this topic, for example, platform design or any other. You're very welcome to join us. Gilbert.
Yes. Let me put together some of the comments from Carl and your latest answers, and let's look at it from, I'm a computer scientist, by the way. I'm not a lawyer, so I have no idea really how the lawyers work, but I have some idea of how they work, and actually had to use some lawyer services at some point. And one of the first things that my lawyer asked me is, what is your end game? What is your goal? What do you want to do? That's the first question. And then you will adapt the way you will counsel me in the process in the end. Maybe we could turn the table around, and instead of having the system nudge the user, we could have the user nudge the system. So if the ODR first would ask the user, what are you expecting from this process? What is your end game for this process? And then, depending on these answers, we show him one design of the system that is aimed at that goal. Now, if we were to do that, the different players in the discussion might not have the same goal. Therefore, they don't have exactly the same interface. That would actually induce friction between the different litigants. And it might actually lead to something that is closer to what we expect from the judicial system, is each one has their own goal, and they're using the system to trying to find a midpoint between their goals, each of them. And that might be a way to go about doing that.
So I think if I understand correctly, what you're suggesting is that we let users shape the kind of process that they go through based on their initially stated preferences.
Exactly.
And I think your intuition is right in the sense that this is what we would want to do in an ideal world, where our users, which are litigants and usually self-represented litigants, come into the process knowing what they want and what they're able to get out of it. And I think a big challenge for online courts is to bring users to the point where they are able to make an informed decision about what their best interest is. And so we would always have that initial stage of getting them first to that point before they can then shape their procedural path and the outcomes that they want to get out of it.
Even their goal could evolve over time. And as you question them about the evolution of their goal, you could tweak the interface towards the new goal that they reached. So if at first they're confrontational and they want 100% payback, and as they move in the process, they change their way, well, I want some knowledge that I was right, then the goal is different. So you change the interface to adapt to the one that fits that goal at that point.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think my general position, and I don't think there's, a right or wrong. It's more of a normative position of how you would view courts. I think courts should stay as neutral as possible under the circumstances, so that they don't, transgress the line of influencing or, actively nudging users towards particular outcomes or choices, but rather provide them with the information and with the options and with the environment that would allow them to make their own reflective, informed, deliberate decisions at any point in time, so that if they want to change their mind, I wouldn't use their initial statement about what they want out of the process in order to help them stick to that decision all throughout. I would keep the process, open for them in a way that enables them to, exercise their autonomy, exercise their self-determination, choose what they want to do at any given point. I think this is, we could say, that a system that wants to induce settlements would design a process in a way that people would more likely choose settlement as the option, and even more importantly, would be more willing to accept the other party's settlement offer. And so, everybody would be happy. They would have a settlement, the costs would be lower, courts would decrease their dockets, cases would end earlier, happy story, right?
But that's not true.
It's not true, exactly. And I think it may not even be true, because if a user enters the system thinking that what they want is a quick settlement, but then after they get informed, they realize that there's something to their case, and I don't know, and they want to pursue it, and they want the defendant to own what they did and whatever, then the system should enable them to do that. And I wouldn't want to change what, so in a completely different study, since I'm very interested in courts generally and in settlements more broadly, I spent in a different study a lot of time observing judges in pretrial hearings and in settlement conferences, the Israeli style, which takes place in a public court. And I wouldn't want to, take this reality where judges pressure parties toward a particular outcome and use the legitimacy of the court, the legitimacy of their role, their position, their power, their status, to nudge litigants toward a particular outcome that they view as beneficial, best case scenario, their view of what's beneficial for the parties, not as happy scenario, which just helps them get cases out of their docket, right? So I wouldn't want to replicate that in a digital system in the more cunning ways.
Yeah, but what I'm suggesting is the other way around. It's the user based on his description of what his goals are, and as they evolve, that will nudge the system and not the other way around.
So I'm not sure I understand what it means for the user to nudge the system.
Well, if you have 5 or 6 different type of interfaces, each one tailored for a specific goal, the nudging would select the design or the interface type that fits the user's goal. So it's not the system that nudges the user, it's the user by selecting its goals that nudges which version of the interface is being used.
Yeah, so basically you're saying the user would make some initial choices that would
Yes.
adjust the interface for them. So yeah, I understand that. I think it's possible in, very easy, simple disputes where, maybe there's not a lot of information that would change how you feel about the case over, as you progress in it. But I'm not sure it holds true when there are multiple interests or multiple issues in the dispute, and in which case, when you learn more about it, you change what you want to get out of the process.
True, but each user will get its own version of the interface, and that's where the friction comes from. And you want that friction to a certain extent.
That's definitely an interesting idea. I think Gilbert, this is something we'll, even because I think in our specific sub-project, Nicholas and I, 5 and 6, we have an ODR sub-project together, and we will definitely bring that suggestion or research ID into our own reflections, and then we'll keep in touch with Ayelet to have her thoughts on this, because I think it's, I really see the promise of having different interface, but also I also see the challenges and questions that it all raises. So thank you for your question. We now have 2 partners. Heather and Richard would like to intervene. So Heather is first.
Hello, a great presentation. I'm just speaking for Public Legal Education Associations in Canada, and we deal with people on the ground. And I guess just 2 comments. I'm interested if perhaps the specialized courts that have been developed, such as the mental health, like in Nova Scotia, we have the mental health court, we have healing circles, we have like domestic violence, I'm just going to say kind of like courts, but special setups, I guess, already to accommodate vulnerable groups and people dealing with difficult issues. So it strikes me that that would be instructive in terms of developing online platforms to kind of mimic some of those processes, especially if they're proven to be working well. And it's interesting because at least here, they talk about there being kind of evaluations and data to support that. But it just strikes me that it's really important that any online systems also need to have the buy-in of the judiciary if they're going to ever get going. And so probably having an approach that's going to help them see themselves in the process too is really important. And I only say that because here in Nova Scotia, we're just starting to get involved as public legal education, working with the courts to design court forms to be more user-friendly. And I guess that would just come back to the second point about, I think it's really interesting, this Carl's idea about kind of nudging the system, because we find, and in the public legal education stats, that over 75% of people contacting us for legal information help are able to be assisted without going to a lawyer, that actually getting the legal information assists them with doing whatever is necessary to deal with the matter. Now, one of the questions, I guess, is around this notion of when timing of friction, because we know that if people can't get access to plain language information to inform themselves, then they drop out. And so I think that's a danger in terms of an online system. If there's too much friction or at the wrong points in time, then people, especially self-represented, aren't going to stick with it. And I guess the other point would be, will lawyers take and milk that to increase their billings, to talk about the fact, well, this is friction and this is a more difficult situation. So I guess those would just be sort of two kind of comments. I think there are pathways forward, but I just also think that in terms of when we're looking at what do people want, we find, like, because we hear from the public regularly, as do many of my colleagues on a daily basis, most people they may have an idea of what they want, but they really don't know. And until they have a bigger picture of the law, what's available to them in the steps in the process and the cost involved, they can't make an informed decision. So we would hope that that would be part of that litmus test. So anyway, thank you. It's fascinating, fascinating work.
So yeah, thank you for your comments. And I think you're spot on with respect to stakeholder engagement. So this has to do both with respect to judges and their involvement in these processes, and lawyers, of course. So first of all, I think my idea is actually not to reduce judicial involvement in cases, but to have different types of judicial involvement throughout the life cycle of the case. So for example, for a judge to be meaningfully involved doesn't necessarily mean to make the decision at the end. It could be just to inject public values or procedural justice safeguards in a settlement that is being formed. And we can think through online procedures how judges may take an active role in the process in different phases, and eventually make for better outcomes and reach more litigants than they do today. So today, the impact of judges in the system is really reserved for a fairly small fraction of litigants. So that's one selling point, I think, for judges, is that they actually extend their impact in terms of the number of citizens that they actually touch, or that they can influence their outcomes in the proceedings. And I think the same goes for lawyers. And I generally think that for any of these reforms to work, lawyers need to be involved in shaping them. And there also need to be new ways of providing legal services, and possibly unbundling some of the way legal aid is provided throughout the process. And also thinking about different roles that lawyers may take in designing these processes to begin with. And a lot of it probably has to do with billing. And I think that the same way that, workplace mediation and settlement and tort settlement and other, case types where the legislator wanted to, remove this sort of foreign interest from shaping the outcome of cases that have worked, is that then there are then some standard billing schemes that enable lawyers to provide some legal assistance in these procedures, still get paid for what they did, and not be fully harmed by, not be harmed by the introduction of these systems. One way in which this would happen is that more people will seek some legal advice for, a case. It would be different. It wouldn't be full representation in the courts. And finally, I think, and I've seen that briefly, what I could see out of the chat that Jacqueline has posted, that this is an empirical question. How much friction versus engagement, usability, friendliness we want to introduce in the system in order sort of to strike the optimal balance? I don't know what the answer is, but I think it is not responsible to design these processes without at least measuring or trying to figure out where the balance lies. I think nowadays, most of the courts are designed to increase engagement, increase usability, make it easy, simple, streamlined, and there is maybe something that's left behind. And I don't know to assess its impact or its nature, because we have no data about this whatsoever. All we've got is just data from other domains where we've seen this to operate. So.
Thank
Yeah.
you. It brings back to the evidence-based. We absolutely need to do empirical research on this topic for sure, because otherwise, we don't have enough data to go forward. I agree. Richard Rogers from the CRT, your turn now.
Thank you, Jean-Francois. Good morning, or good afternoon, I guess, for you, Ayelet. Very nice to see you again. I just wanted to say, first off, your presentation was very timely, since we're just in the process of engaging a consultant in behavioral insights to basically go through our entire process and user interfaces with some of that in mind. So it was also enlightening to hear your comments about this friction in the UX UI design. That, of course, as you've probably heard Shannon say several times, the goal is the user experience, that we are very user-focused, trying to make it easier. Yet, one of the goals in our process will be to address this issue that people, from our perspective, just don't read things and they don't understand what we've asked them to do. And maybe part of the approach will be to make it harder for them to read the instructions so they actually have to focus on them more. So that was very enlightening for me. Also, just some of your initial observations as far as outcomes. And of course, one of our ideal outcomes is to reduce the number of disputes that go all the way through the adjudication process. But in fact, in hindsight, that may not be such a bad thing when they do, because in some cases, you're not going to have parties who are on the same wavelength, or parties who may just settle through attrition. They're exhausted, they don't understand the process, it's taking too long. So we don't automatically, or we don't want to automatically assume that an adjudication is a bad outcome in a dispute, that it is a necessary availability for the parties, I think. So it is, just again, appreciate your comments on that area.
Thanks very much, and thanks for your great work. I think one of the key challenges is to be the first that's doing things, and I think it's inspiring to see, you know, really how the CRT has led really a different approach to thinking about online courts, and I think it's really had an impact with its user-centric approach on other courts. I really want to commend you for that. It's a pleasure to have you here listening, and I'm grateful for your feedback.
It's great. It's great to have the CRT on board, of course. Great collaboration with and great leadership that we can be all proud of. I have no other hand raised. Maybe, and we're close to 10 o'clock. Ayelet, maybe, well, one thing that I don't know if you have written a paper on e-nudging, published in 2019 in Journal of Dispute Resolution, one of the greatest top 5 academic journal in the world on the topic of dispute resolution. So I encourage everyone to read that paper. Your presentation was definitely giving us very summarize that paper in a very efficient and clear and easy to understand way. So so if you're I don't know if we can have access to that. I had access to it, but
I'm happy to send you the paper so you can circulate it. Yeah.
To everyone. All right. Thank you very much. Okay, so I don't see any other, and it's almost 10 o'clock.
Yeah, I want to thank you for the opportunity and for the really interesting discussion, and I look forward to more opportunities for collaboration. It was interesting because only in retrospect, after I've read more about your particular project on the website, I realized that we have a lot of other intersections really in the field of machine learning and the law, and of using AI to create more tools and generate more insights for lawyers and for users of the legal system. So I hope maybe next year we'll meet again to discuss this completely other area of intersection, and I will continue now to follow closely on how you progress on this really interesting work. So
thank you
very much.
And hopefully we'll be able to receive you in Montreal then.
Oh yes.
Well, yes, when we'll be able to fly again, that would be great.
I think Nicolas did want to say
you actually stole the words out of my mouth, Karim. I just wanted to thank Ayelet for her presentation, and it was actually quite refreshing to hear some of the explanations that you gave that Karim and myself have been saying for years. So to hear somebody else give these same examples and explanations was quite comforting. And you have an open invitation to come to Montreal once the travel bans are lifted.
Thanks very much. I would love that.
Merci
Thanks,
beaucoup.
Ayelet. That was great.
Thank you.